This is really the story of the Western Sephardim, who were the Portuguese Jews. That is essentially the answer to the question of who are the Western Sephardim. But of course, opens up a whole range of questions of what, Portugal? How does that fit into the story? The lectures till now have looked at the story of Sephardim, broadly speaking, right? Going back to the very beginning of Jewish settlement, or at least kind of mass Jewish settlement in the Iberian Peninsula, kind of beginning in the 9th century, 10th century. That first epoch of Sephardi life in Muslim-controlled Spain, and then looking at, from the 1200s to 1500, the story of Jewish life in Christian Spain. And we've seen how at each of those moments, Jews ended up leaving at different stages, at times when things were more difficult or where there was conflict or persecution, etc. And so we saw how Jews ended up in places outside of Spain while still being, right, Sephardi Jews, right? And that we see that already, we've mentioned this several times with Maimonides, right? Calling himself, even though he left in the 12th century, right, the Sephardi Moses, right? Moshe HaSephardi. And he ends up in Egypt. Now, the significant moment of kind of mass exodus out of Iberia, right, comes as a result of what we studied in the previous lecture, which is the expulsion from Spain, right? And that's when, well, Jewish life ostensibly, right, ends in Spain, right? From that point forward, you don't have any Jewish people in Spain, or shall we say no openly Jewish people in Spain, right? We began to look at the story of forced conversions and the conversos, right? The anusim, the bnei anusim that were in Spain. But that essentially from 1492 forward, there is no lawful, open Jewish life in Spain. Anything that would have continued would have to be done clandestinely. There had been an Inquisition already established in 1481, and so anybody practicing Judaism would have done so at great risk, because anyone living there would have had to have undergone conversion. So it would have been legally, as far as Spain was concerned, to be Catholics. And so the observance of Judaism would have been seen as heresy, right? Potentially liable with the death penalty, right? And we spoke about how the Inquisition functioned and how trials worked and, first chances, second chances, admitting, denying, right? We kind of spoke about the complexities of those proceedings. And we spoke about kind of a bit around the questions of sincerity, insincerity, over kind of the objectives of the Inquisition. Elements we'll probably explore a bit more tonight in the context of Portugal. This creates a huge rupture in the Jewish world, right? This wave of immigrants that leave and end up going to some places where there already were Jews living there, right? Either Jewish people who had left centuries before from Spain and ended up in places, or people who had maybe never been in Spain at all, right? So you have Jews going to North Africa, where there were the Jews who, these Berber Jews, right? These Jews who had maybe come across North Africa in the 9th, 10th century and settled in Algeria and in, Tunisia and in Egypt, of course, and in Morocco. And then you have these Sephardi Jews who go there, right? And so you'll end up with two communities in some of these places, right? Kind of the earlier Jewish communities, and then these later ones, some of them that will continue to speak Spanish, right? And will be maybe more in the coastal towns of some of these places. And the more inland Jews are the ones who'd been there longer, right? Living in the hills or wherever they might be. And again, we'll talk more about some of these communities potentially next week, but they end up in Italy and in the Ottoman Empire, ultimately in Israel, right? In areas that are kind of controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And in some of those places, they will dominate the pre-existing communities. In some places, there will be, both communities will persist. We spoke about the amalgamation of different regions of Spain as they go to these new places, and they have to find a way to now live together. So you have Catalonese Jews and Castilian Jews, and Jews from different areas now living in the same place in separate synagogues, merging into it's a process that it's a huge shall we say impact on the Jewish world. Spain had been the most vibrant, largest, probably cultured, wealthy Jewish community in the world, and it is, disintegrates overnight, scattered across the Mediterranean, and the impact lasts for generations. Those are what we often think of the Eastern Sephardim, right? The Sephardim who leave Spain and head to the east, okay? That's not the story of the Western Sephardim. The Western Sephardim end up taking excuse me.
Differentiate between the ones who went to Northern Europe and the ones who went to the Mediterranean. They're all Eastern?
So at this stage, they're not going to Northern Europe.
They're not?
They're not going to Northern Europe, okay? So we'll get to them later, right? But the Western Sephardim in 1492 are the Jews who leave Spain and go to Portugal, okay? Now, it makes a lot of sense. Portugal is next door. You don't have to get on a boat, right? The language is an Iberian language, right? If you hear that spoken, they sound a bit different, but if you read them, they're fairly similar, right? It's essentially the same language. The weather is the same. A lot of the cultural influences are going to be the same, right? So it feels quite familiar. It's a bit different, but it's quite familiar, right? Think of moving from America to Canada. They're not the same, there's differences, but it's more similar than maybe moving to someplace else. Right, exactly. So in that context, it's not surprising that a significant number of Spanish Jews moved to Portugal, taking on top of it that there already is a pre-existing Spanish Jewish community living in Portugal. Now, we don't think of Portuguese Jewry as dating back to those early centuries, but certainly the century beforehand, throughout the 15th century, there is a Jewish community in Lisbon. We know that the Abravanel family had lived in Portugal for several generations before Don Isaac of Abravanel moved back to Spain. He was very close with the government, and eventually leaves with the exiles and ends up going to Italy. But his family had been in Portugal before he was in Spain. So there was a pre-existing Jewish community of Jewish life in Portugal. Many of the exiles end up going to Portugal. And as I mentioned last time, the question of numbers is, I've not seen any kind of compelling figure for this. There are different numbers you see in the scholarship. Some who look at the numbers of Spanish Jewry as having been in the hundreds of thousands, some who put it in the tens of thousands. So obviously based on that, then you have to figure out, well, it's tens of thousands, then some went here, some went there, some went there. So you're dealing with smaller numbers. If you're dealing with hundreds of thousands, obviously, then you're dealing with larger numbers. I haven't seen any compelling information. I think it's one of those things where it's probably just simply left unresolved exactly how many people we're talking about, when 1492 comes along, and how many people therefore end up in these various regions. But it clearly was sizable enough from the influence and impact that they ultimately have on the places that they go to. And so what's interesting is in Portugal, you'll end up finding people who will settle, in regions across Portugal. I mean, unsurprisingly, you find them in some of the border areas. So, right, people cross the border and settle there. And if you go to Portugal, you can see some of the bridges kind of between Spain and Portugal. And they say that, that was, in some of those places, Jews dominated the population, right? Because they go there in large numbers and settle there, and all of a sudden you might have a town that had, a few hundred people living there beforehand. Now it has a population of several thousand, and obviously the majority of them were these Spanish exiles. But they end up kind of going to different, so not only those border areas, places like Guarda and Trancosa, but kind of further inland as well, and ultimately in places like Porto, obviously Lisbon, probably Évora, Coimbra, right? Kind of all the places where you kind of think of important populations. One of the places that's been kind of discovered as having had a synagogue was in Tomar. There's a synagogue that was identified, a small synagogue. It's not so far from Lisbon. You can visit that place today. And so that probably is from the 15th century, when there had been a Jewish community there. And so that's the beginning of the story, but it's a short story because in 1496, the king, who had been there, after having first, allowed Jews to be there, King Zhao, his son, King Manuel, decides to expel the Jews. So they get to Portugal after having been expelled from Spain, and a few years later, they are expelled from Portugal. But they're not. And so this is kind of where the story gets complicated. What essentially happens in 1496, there is an edict of expulsion. They need to leave by 1497. But it is clear that there is no interest in actually expelling the Jewish population because they essentially don't let people leave. Okay? And we'll get to, maybe I'll talk about how do they do that? How do they do that? So what essentially happens in 1496, they abduct the children. They abduct the Jewish children, and they tell their parents, if you would like your children, you need to convert. Otherwise, your children are going to be given to good Catholic families, and they'll be raised as good Catholics. If you'd like your children, you convert, and then you can raise them as good Catholics. So you're a family, your children have just been abducted. What choice do you make? Do you say, fine, I'll convert and get your kids back? Or do you say, no, I'm holding on to my Jewish faith? You can imagine, right, the pressure that would have had, and you would have had a significant number of families choosing to convert. In fact, we know that some of those children were actually abducted and sent to the island of São Tomé, where they were forced to work on plantations. There's a story that hundreds of them were actually killed by alligators. There's like these kind of strange stories about what happened to them. But clearly reflects this story that they had been taken. And then what you have is basically the decision that says that by 1497 you need to leave, and there are boats that are ordered to go to the ports of Lisbon. You're supposed to go to Lisbon to get on a boat that will take you out of Portugal. But what happens is when they get there, they are all corralled together and basically put into detention. And they're all told, sorry, you're staying in detention indefinitely. If you want to leave, you need to convert. And so essentially, they are all forced, little by little, to convert to Catholicism. The story goes that there were 4 old Jews left at the end, and then they said, fine, the 4 of you can leave. But essentially, everybody else was essentially not forced to convert, but were all forced to convert. Now, why did he do this? Right? Why do they do that? Well, clearly he didn't actually want them to go. So if he didn't want them to go, why is he forcibly converting them? So what it seems is that the king wanted his son, Manuel, to marry the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And her stipulation is, our kingdom has just rid itself of its Jewish population. I will marry you on condition that you do the same in your country. And so in order to effect this marriage, they needed to expel their Jewish population, but they weren't really keen on the Jewish population leaving. And so they basically found a way to compel the Jewish population to actually stay, but to mask their staying by having them convert. And we'll get back to this a little bit later, but essentially that will lead eventually to Spain and Portugal merging in 1580. Okay? And there will be a saying in Portugal, I think it's a saying that even now people say, that the only thing that comes from Spain are bad marriages and bad weather, right? And it's a reference to this because essentially Spain will take over Portugal in 1580, and it won't end until 1640 when they basically revolt and reclaim their independence from Spain. But it had been the intent when this marriage was done was that it would eventually lead to them being one unified kingdom. We'll get back to this population in a bit. Things don't go so well. All of a sudden, you have this kind of mass population of converted Jews. They're the new Christians, right, to distinguish them between the old Christians. And they, as you can imagine, are seen with a degree of kind of, incredulousness from the native Catholic population, right? Kind of knowing, who are all these people that are now, able to, take our jobs, that are now coming to church with us, right? Are part of this this world where all of a sudden you have all of these people who are there who, are kind of not who you would think they are. And there's a massacre that occurs in Lisbon in 1506. The numbers are probably around 3,000 of these new Christians that are murdered. The story goes that they're in church, and all of a sudden there's like this light that shines, onto the altar. And everyone, says, "Oh my gosh, it's a sign, it's a miracle." And the story goes that one of the new Christian calls out and says, "No, it's, it's coming, it's a light in the ceiling and it's bouncing off of this jewel and it's being refracted, and that's where this light is coming from. It's not like there's just some like light that's appearing, on I don't know if it was on a statue of Mary or of Jesus, something like that." And some of the old Christians are, shocked by this, denial of this, this miracle, and, basically say they're a bunch of disbelievers. They don't actually believe, they're heretics, and it whips people up, and they light, a massive bonfire outside of the church, and there kind of becomes this massacre of the Jewish population. Or the new Christian population. If you go to Lisbon, nowadays there is a memorial at the location of this church. Right, it has like a Star of David on it, and there's a wall there that it says in many languages, I think peace or something, or tolerance, something like that. And it's a memorial to these 3,000 new Christians that were murdered. That seems to lead to a little bit of the loosening of kind of emigration restrictions, and we think that some new Christians will leave after 1506, right? The government, right, the monarchy needs to kind of lower tensions, and so there's kind of the ability to say, okay, some new Christians want to go, you can go. So we know that some of them leave and probably going over to Italy that will go then. So those are kind of like these early Portuguese Jews, right? These are people who had only been living as Catholics for a few years and will kind of go places, and you'll find kind of these Portuguese communities that end up in Salonika and things like that, probably related to this kind of early exodus of some population that goes. But many of them don't go. They've been converted. Again, this is their world. This is where they are. They're not about to up and kind of go new places, and who knows what's going to be. And that's where things will continue. What will happen is in 1534, Portugal will institute an Inquisition. Okay? We'll get back to that in a moment. There hadn't been an Inquisition until then, right? So in Spain, you have an Inquisition in 1481, an expulsion in 1492. In Portugal, it's the opposite. You have a kind of a expulsion, forced conversion in 1497, and an Inquisition only happens afterwards in the 1530s. Okay, so let's kind of pause it there, because this is kind of the opportunity to take a step back and reflect on what's really going on over here. What's going on over here? And I'll start this by saying, if you look in the early records of this community, right, at Bevismark Synagogue, or if you go to Amsterdam today, to the Sephardi community there, they are known as the Portuguese Jews. Not the Spanish and Portuguese, but as the Portuguese Jews. And so that's because the founders are coming from Portugal. They're seen as Portuguese. They're not seen as being Spanish. And that's important because what will take root in Portugal is something that doesn't happen in Spain. I mentioned last class that in Spain, the Inquisition essentially stops acting against secret Jewish observance in 1515. You find in the Inquisition records that there are kind of court cases there are tribunals against secret Judaism, but by 1515 you don't find it anymore. It seems that essentially they succeed. They got rid of the open Jews. The ones who had previously converted, or people that came back to Spain not having been able to find a place to escape to, they convert, and within a generation or so, they seem to have, been absorbed into the population. They're not trying to maintain secret Jewish practice. There are not cases for the Inquisition to try anymore. They've succeeded, right, in quelling secret Judaism. And you find that the cases that they follow then are witchcraft and, Protestantism that will begin, right? Other kinds of heresies from their perspective. But Judaism seems to be something then of the past, right? What that essentially tells you is that image we have of, the secret Jews, the conversos, right? To use the pejorative term, right? The marranos, right? Which perhaps means the swine, right? So we don't tend to use that term anymore, right? That's not really so much a Spanish phenomenon. Maybe in the 15th century it was. So where does that come from, that image we have, that romantic view of, the secret Judaism being practiced? It's Portugal. It's actually the Portuguese Jews where that exists. And you find a robust crypto-Judaism being observed in Portugal. It seems to be something which is persistent, which is ongoing, which is evasive, that continues in Portugal until you get to 1580, and then you start finding it in Spain too. Why do you find it in Spain? Because they unite, right? Spain and Portugal finally unite, and as a result, there is freedom of movement. And so all of a sudden, you have people who maybe their family 100 years before had come from Spain, went to Portugal, now go back to Spain and end up places like Seville or Madrid. And you once again start finding in the tribunal records of the Inquisition cases trying secret Judaism. But it will invariably always be from those people who had come from Portugal. Maybe originally had come from Spain, but had at least been for a time in Portugal. Right? Those are the people that are observing or that are kind of maintaining this crypto-Judaism. And so kind of from that time forward, once you kind of get to 1580, you will then find cases of crypto-Judaism being tried by the Inquisitions in both Spain and Portugal. I'll talk about why in a little bit. But just kind of taking this story forward is what you find is that it won't even be limited entirely to the Iberian Peninsula. Because during this era, what do you also have happen? Well, you have the beginning of the Portuguese and Spanish empires, right? So in essentially this, the 16th century, right, you have the beginning of the Age of Exploration, right? 1492, Columbus, right, discovers, right, as far as Europe is concerned, right, the Americas, and you will begin to have exploration of this new world as far as they're concerned, and there will be a treaty between the Portuguese and Spanish that essentially decide to divide the world in half between them and decide, this half will be Spain, this half will be Portugal, and the line will be drawn in such a way that kind of the eastern part of South America will be part of Portugal and also the Far East as well. So you'll end up having Portuguese, colonization of what becomes Brazil, of Goa in India, right? All these kind of these southeastern places, and then things that are kind of to the west will be controlled by the Spanish, Peru, Colombia, Mexico. Okay, and so what you find is that there are then also people of Jewish descent who will settle in those places too. Perhaps thinking, we're at a safe distance, right? We can go there and maybe we can kind of get away with more. And so you'll eventually have tribunals that will be set up in Lima, in Cartagena, in Colombia, in Mexico City. Incidentally, the Portuguese won't. Cases that they have will be sent back to Portugal itself. It won't be held in there, so they'll kind of be transporting those who they have identified as needing to be tried by the Inquisition. And so you'll end up having the Inquisition that will kind of span these like wide areas and will be kind of quite incessant. And so you'll find cases of crypto-Judaism in the New World. And in fact, there are people, who come from Central America, right, who believe, right, that they are descendants of those crypto-Jews who are there. And there are stories even in places like, New Mexico, right, in the southwestern America, right, of people who believe that they have ancestry, of people who kind of escape from, Mexico City and go further into the periphery of the empire, thinking maybe that there they can go and they can settle. And we know that there are cases of crypto-Judaism in these places, of people who are observing. Now, there are some who have claimed that crypto-Judaism didn't exist in a sense, in a natural way, but that crypto-Judaism emerges out of the activities of the Inquisition. Right? There's one book that was published that referred to it as the Marrano Factory, which is not, some people don't like this book at all, which basically claims that the new Christians were persecuted for, because they are new Christians, not because they actually were secret Judaizers, and Perhaps the Inquisition was interested in their money, wanted to take their resources, maybe for political gain, to limit competition, whatever the case may be. But as a result of the persecutions of the Inquisition, it made some of the new Christians say, why are we being persecuted? Oh, because we used to be Jews. What is Judaism all about? And in a sense, it kind of caused this reawakening of new Christians to kind of reclaim their heritage that in fact they had abandoned previously, but that there wasn't actually this kind of continuity of secret Judaism throughout the era. Now, no doubt there must be examples of that actually having been the case, but it seems probably even more compelling to know that there absolutely had been also kind of an ongoing, recurrent crypto-Judaism in these places, with the recognition that obviously there were no Jewish schools, there were no synagogues, right? Any maintenance of Jewish identity would have been, because, well, they were new Christians, but would have been done in this kind of clandestine, obviously what we might think of as, necessarily watered down kind of oral type of transmission of Jewish practice, right? So something that would have become increasingly, unrooted in terms of maybe a Judaism that we would recognize, but clearly has its origins in there. So, maybe somebody's saying, I'm going to fast every 10th of September, right? That's how they did Yom Kippur, right? The 10th of Tishrei, right? So finding ways to kind of do aspects of Judaism, but without being able to live compelling, full Jewish lives in the way that we would think, that it would look. So the question is why? And this is kind of the question I think I want to spend a little bit of time on as our kind of piece of Portugal. Why is it? Why is it that this exists in Portugal or originates in Portugal while it isn't something that kind of survives in Spain? Why is it that we call the community of Amsterdam the Portuguese synagogue, right? Why was Bevis Marx known as the Portuguese community before becoming eventually the Spanish and Portuguese community? And the reason is for several reasons, part of which relates to their original conversion. Now, why is it that the King of Portugal wanted to convert his Jews while the monarchs in Spain were happy to expel their Jewish population? So the reason seems to be rooted in the fact that Spain had something that Portugal didn't have, and that was converted Jews. Now, to understand this, you have to appreciate kind of medieval society and the fact that at that time, right, a large segment of the population were the serfs, right, kind of the peasantry, and then you would have the ruling class, right, the aristocracy, right? So you didn't have a middle class, right? You kind of had this kind of all-powerful landowners and so on, and then you would have the poor people who would work the land. The merchant class were the Jews, right? That was the role that they played within society. Now, once you have the massacres of 1391, right, that forces Jews to convert in Spain, they now have a population of Christians who are filling that merchant class, that middle class of society. And so by the time you get to 1492, there already is that class of society that exists in Spain, where in a sense they don't need Jews anymore, because they've got the descendants of Jews already doing the jobs that other Jews are doing. And so for them, getting rid of Jews gets rid of, in their mind, perhaps one problem, that, right, something that they don't want, but they don't have the economic fallout that you would have in a place like Portugal that doesn't have a converted Jewish population. And so if they expel their Jews, they won't have a merchant class. And so they're left in trouble. If they expel their Jews, their kind of beginning of this, this age of exploration falls apart because you don't have the class that in a sense is helping to do that, right? Navigators and traders and things you need as you have society moves out of this medieval way of doing business into a more kind of international way of doing business, which is rooted in trade, the moving of goods and so forth, which is what the Jewish population is kind of, that's the part of the socioeconomic class, the economic part of the society that they play. And so what he has to do is to forcibly convert them because he needs that population to be there. But taking into account that ostensibly they only do it because they're forced to in order to enact this marriage. And so the big difference between Portugal and Spain is when they convert their Jews now in 1497, they don't at the same time also establish an inquisition. And that seems to be an indication to the Jewish population there that they don't care that they are actually Jews or that they're practicing Judaism. They need them to just look like Catholics. And so as a result, you seem to have taking shape in Portugal is this almost acceptance of crypto-Judaism that takes place. And it won't be until a generation later that all of a sudden now people say, wait a second, we have people who are supposed to be Catholics who are practicing Judaism, and that shouldn't be okay. And then you have them establish an inquisition. But by that point, you already have firmly established in Portugal is an active crypto-Jewish life that has been accepted, that is part of kind of the network of the place. And so as a result, that inquisition really does probably have work to do if you take it sincerely, because there really are lots of people probably practicing crypto-Judaism. But at the same time, it's also well established. And so, they will already be used to living double lives, double identities, publicly Catholics, privately Jews. And so maybe they're more adept at navigating how to kind of maintain that double life, even once the Inquisition starts trying to look around. Now, you take on top of that the fact that in Portugal, not only do they exist there, but they exist as a distinct minority because they come in and they are the new Christians. They play a specific economic function. And so they form a distinct socioeconomic population, and they actually live in new neighborhoods. And so if you go to Lisbon or to places like Porto particularly I'm thinking of, the town is built on hills. There's like a place where there used to be a river. The new population is put in new housing that's built on the other side. Today it's Porto, but then it was like another hill. And that hill was all where the new Christians lived. Right? There's even some people who claim that the basements of these homes had interlinking doors, right? So they could privately gather with each other without having to go outside to walk into a single home, right? Perhaps to have minyan, right? To pray. And so you have them living in the same neighborhood, in the same business, marrying each other, right? Practicing endogamy. They are forming a distinct socioeconomic class. And so again, that gives them greater fortitude to withstand, right, the Inquisition, and also has allowed them to properly establish a subculture that is able to persist. Now you add on top of that something else. It wasn't like in Spain where you had, some people expelled, some people not expelled, some people decide to stay, some people go. There, everyone is forced to convert. There is no expulsion. And so you have an entire community, in one fell swoop that's converted. And so you have family units, you have neighborhoods, you have, friends, right? Essentially, you just say, okay, this entire Jewish neighborhood is now Catholic. I mean, again, they have their networks. It's the same community. It's the same people. It's the same people that they're interacting with. And you take on top of it one more thing, in Spain, where in a sense people had a choice, right? As much as you can call it a choice, right? To expel or not. So who leaves? Right? Who are the people who would have definitely left Spain amongst the Jews? I mean, you would assume at the very least the most devout, right, were leaving, right? So if you were like a really committed Jew, right, the rabbis, right, doesn't matter the fact that you don't know where you're going to go, it's going to be hard, you're getting on that boat and you're leaving. You are not converting to Catholicism. Now, I'm not criticizing those who did convert. I'm just saying, like, there's a certain population who clearly wasn't going to convert. So the people who end up in Portugal, in the first instance, are the people who cared enough, if I could use that word, who had the fortitude enough to say that we are leaving our homes and going someplace new. So it's already a subgroup of the Spanish Jews who presumably were those who were even more committed to living as Jews who go there. So you have the people who are the most committed Spanish Jews who end up going to Portugal, as they do to North Africa and to the east. And then you have everybody converted. And so that doesn't just include everyone, that includes the rabbis, the teachers, right? The ritual slaughterers, the people who had been the scribes. The entire community is converted. So you have this community of people who are converted, who are presumably the most religious, the most committed, the most knowledgeable. They're all converted as a group. They live in their own neighborhoods. They marry amongst each other. There's no inquisition because they don't actually care what people are doing behind closed doors. And so it's not surprising that in that population, you essentially have an entire world that exists in a way that it never obviously was possible to exist in Spain, and certainly doesn't exist after the Spanish expulsion. And so you have really kind of taking root in Portugal is a kind of a deeply rooted crypto-Judaism. Now, again, what it looked like, obviously, over generations without access to kind of open Jewish life will obviously degrade over time, but there is a strong sense of identity, right? There, in fact, even when they will leave, and we'll talk about that in future classes, when they go to other parts in Europe and to the Americas, right? They will call themselves the Portuguese nation, right? They identify with, as a group, as these Portuguese Jews, right? This Portuguese nation, as it were. In fact, when you look at records, when you often find references to Portuguese traders, it's usually also code word for Jew. It's interchangeable, right? They are that class of people that are kind of engaging in that kind of economic sphere. And so in 1580, when you have a merging of Spain and Portugal, you'll have some of these people who will seek opportunity and will end up in Seville, will end up in Madrid, right? And so anybody who's Portuguese, right, who are the people who are moving to Spain? It's the merchant class. So any Portuguese person in Spain is suspect for maybe actually being a crypto-Jew. And so you have the Inquisition in Spain start gearing up again to start trying to look and see, who are these Portuguese people? Are they actually crypto-Jews? And then from Spain, they will end up going to the New World and settling in Spanish territories. From Portugal, they will end up going and settling in Portuguese territories. When eventually Brazil will be conquered by the Dutch, many of the people that are there relapse, right? Return to Jewish life, right? And maybe we'll talk a bit more about that population in future class as part of this series. But essentially, right, they kind of have this unique experience, right? These Portuguese Jews, right? These Portuguese new Christians of a very distinct experience of having a unified community that is, a distinct population, right? Because they're labeled as new Christians, they can't effectively fully integrate into Portuguese society. So they remain separate from society, right? Old Christian families often don't want to marry with new Christian families unless they do it because out of economic necessity, right? So they might do it because, but there's always going to be a stigma then with their family that, oh, one of your ancestors was a new Christian. And they maintain records on all of these things, right? The Inquisition records, as I said, are really quite detailed. They show networks, right? There clearly were networks of crypto-Jews who are maintaining elements of Judaism. From time to time, they might smuggle in a book from an actual Jewish traveler through Spain and Portugal, and they'll tell them, you give them the calendar for that year. And there's all kinds of things that you find in the Inquisition records that talk about these Portuguese new Christians and the world that they created, the networks that they had. Incidentally, a lot of it was maintained through the mothers, right? Because it would be the mother who would tell the child, you'd wait till the kid was old enough that you think they could keep a secret. Because if they spilled it to the nanny, well, the whole family could get taken in by the Inquisition. So it was very dangerous. Oftentimes it would happen on a long walk in a field somewhere, right, where nobody could overhear the conversation, where you would have to know that maybe the initial reaction of the child would be negative. And so you'd have to have time for them to calm down before they could come home and not blurt it out to the housekeeper, right? It was fraught. It was definitely fraught. And as you imagine, over time, some of them probably did simply assimilate and become sincere Catholics and, or at least insincere Catholics, but certainly not crypto-Jews, right? And so obviously it becomes increasingly mixed over the centuries. But what you'll find is, particularly whenever there are moments of increased inquisitorial activity, you will have populations of new Christians that will leave Spain and Portugal, that will leave Portugal and will go to places outside of the reach of the Inquisition where they can live free. Now, are they all leaving because they're actually crypto-Jews? Are they leaving out of fear that they'll be accused of being crypto-Jews? It's probably all of the above. But when they go to those new places, obviously the people that they'll want to connect with are people who have also come from Portugal, which will often be now people living open Jewish lives. And so then that will create this kind of process of, do they also return to being Jews? What does it mean to be a Jew? Maybe they don't even know what it means to be a Jew anymore. They've been living generations as Catholics who maybe just do a bit of Judaism in private, light candles in their basement, who knows? And now all of a sudden, there's a lot involved in being a Jew. And, it's not something so easy. And yet you have this remarkable network of people, these new Christians, these Portuguese nation that emerges in Portugal and becomes this really significant class or sub-community of the Jewish nation. And so what we'll need to explore in future classes, and we'll look at kind of where they go, is what emerges out of these Portuguese new Christians when they leave Portuguese and Spanish held territories and kind of have the opportunity to chart their own path, right? And the paths that they will take and the communities that they will found, obviously famously Amsterdam here in London, but we'll look at that in terms of looking at kind of what they create in Europe and what they create in the Americas. But this is really the story of the Western Sephardim. When we talk about the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the S&P Jews, it's the Jews that emanate from this particular population, right, of Jews who lived as Christians in Portugal and then leave Portugal and return to Jewish life, right? Those are the Western Sephardim. They're not completely detached from the other Sephardim. They have a different additional experience in Iberia that creates or turns them into kind of a distinctive subcategory of Sephardic Jews, but colors their culture and their professions and their experiences, and obviously the lives that they will build even once they leave Iberia and will eventually return to kind of open Jewish lives. So we'll continue that story in the next class when we'll look at where they go in Europe. Thank you.